Don't look now, but there's a real chance that the 2028 election will not be decided by the Electoral College. If you talk to any plugged-in Democrat, the #1 trait they're looking for in their next presidential nominee is the ability to win the Electoral College. That might not be necessary anymore, thanks to recent movement from Virginia Democrats. But a big part of this hinges on Democrats' ability to do something they haven't really done in the Trump era. Before we get to that, let's give some background as to what we're talking about here. Efforts to abolish the Electoral College and replace it with a national popular vote have existed for decades. The closest we ever came was in 1969, when the House of Representatives voted to pass a constitutional amendment to end the Electoral College. Then President Richard Nixon endorsed it. More than 80% of both parties voted for it. In fact, Republicans voted for it at a higher percentage than Democrats. It looked like it was really moving. And then it died in the Senate. Since then, polls have generally shown American voters still mostly favor a popular vote, but the momentum for a constitutional amendment has basically dried up. So more recently, states have started to take things into their own hands. In April, Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger signed legislation officially adding Virginia to the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This compact dates back to 2006. Back then, it was this kind of zany, harebrained idea, galvanized mostly because liberals were still furious over George W. Bush's 2000 victory, which was the first time in over 100 years that someone became president after losing the popular vote. And the idea was pretty simple. Instead of hoping, wishing, waiting for a constitutional amendment, states would make an end run by pledging their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. So instead of, say, California's 55 electoral votes going to who got more votes in California, they would go to who got more votes nationally. Now here's the thing. The agreement only comes into effect when enough states join to comprise 270 electoral votes, the number it takes to win, no earlier. And for a long time, it looked like we were not anywhere close to that. Yeah, every few years, a new blue state would join, but it was still a long way off. But over the past few years, and especially this year, that has changed. Spanberger's signature is really significant for a couple reasons. First, it makes Virginia the 19th state to join the compact, bringing the agreement to 222 electoral votes, more than 80% of the way to 270. And second, it represents what's really changed about this effort. It's no longer confined to deep blue states. Of the states Kamala Harris won in 2024, Virginia was her third narrowest margin. And the state with the second narrowest margin, Minnesota, ratified the compact in 2023. So this is slowly, finally, spread out of just the deepest blue parts of the country, which is what it was always going to need to do if the compact was going to work. If you actually want this to have an impact, to be something that could have, say, blocked Trump from winning in 2016, you need swing states to join. And that's where 2026 has become incredibly crucial. In the midterms this year, Democrats have their best shot in the modern era to win trifecta control in a bunch of swing states. We've talked about trifectas on the show before, where one party has control of the governorship and both houses of the state legislature. As the country has gotten more polarized, they've become much more common. But Democrats have historically had more trouble than Republicans in achieving them. Right now, there are 23 states with GOP trifectas, to only 16 for Democrats. In fact, Democrats have been trailing ever since the 2010 elections. And trifectas are super important here, because, to put it bluntly, the only way for a state to join the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is for it to be controlled by Democrats. Now, that didn't actually used to be the case. Before 2016, Republican-controlled chambers in states like Oklahoma and Arizona passed legislation to join the compact. But after Trump's 2016 victory, we saw views of the popular vote and the Electoral College polarize significantly along party lines. And now, even though Republican voters are much more pro-popular vote than their leaders, it's still completely and totally tied to Democrats' power. And that's where the 2026 map comes in. When you look at the battles over state control in the 2026 elections, there is a real shot for Democrats to win a whole bunch of new trifectas, specifically in 5 swing states: Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. In Arizona and Wisconsin, Democrats have the governorship, but Republicans have the legislature. In Nevada, it's the opposite. And in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Democrats have the governorship and one house of the legislature. The reason this matters so much is simple. If Democrats win trifectas in even some of these states and join the compact, it will hit the 270 electoral votes needed to go into effect before the 2028 election. Now, independent elections analysts generally rank all of these states as having gubernatorial races this year that are either competitive or leaning towards Democrats. And they also generally rank the battle for those state legislatures as either toss-ups or slightly leaning one way or the other. But even beyond those ratings, there is a real case to be made that 2026 is Democrats' best shot in these states. And the reasons vary state by state. In Pennsylvania, for example, Josh Shapiro is expected to win re-election by a huge margin, and he's putting in a ton of money and effort to flip the legislature so he can pass more legislation ahead of his very likely 2028 campaign. In Wisconsin, they had heavily gerrymandered pro-Republican state legislative maps for years and years. They got rid of them in 2024, so this is actually the first midterm with a Republican president in which the state has fair maps. In Nevada, the state legislative maps are heavily gerrymandered for Democrats, meaning they're basically guaranteed full control if they win the governorship. And even beyond any of that, in general, there is reason to think that a Trump midterm is a great opportunity for Democrats in state legislatures. In 2017, the first year of Trump's first term, the party held 6 trifectas nationwide. After the 2018 midterms, that had more than doubled to 14. And with Democrats' turnout advantage in off-year and midterm elections only seeming to increase since then, there is a real case that this is the party's best shot at unified control in these swing states since Barack Obama was elected. And if they actually got that, it would be a pretty huge deal. I wrote about this in my newsletter recently. Remember to subscribe to that and to the channel here. But here's one way to think about it. During Obama's presidency, Republicans got trifecta control in a bunch of Obama-won states: Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, even Maine. But since Trump first won in 2016, Democrats have only achieved a trifecta in a Trump-won state once: Michigan, from 2022 to 2024. So being able to finally break through that wall would be potentially big for the popular vote compact, but it would also be a big breakthrough for the party in general. So does that mean 2028 is locked, sealed popular vote? No. There's still 2 big wildcards. The first is that there's no total guarantee that Democratic control will automatically translate to joining the compact. In 2019, the then Democratic governor of Nevada vetoed legislation to join. And in 2024, when they had a trifecta, Michigan Democrats' legislation to join died in committee. So there's always some uncertainty. But part of the significance of Spanberger's signature was the signal it sent to other Democrats. Here was this moderate-ish mainline Democrat in a light blue state, and she signed it. What's your excuse? Second is the constitutional question. This is a bit complicated and something legal scholars are a little divided on, so let's make it pretty simple. Essentially, there's a fair bit of debate around whether the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, A, is constitutional at all, and B, even if it is, if it requires approval from Congress. On the first part, there are all sorts of challenges that have been written about. Some people have argued, for example, that it violates the equal protection guarantee of the 14th Amendment, because it allows votes in different states to mean wildly different things. But the biggest objection comes down to one part of Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which states that, quote, no state shall enter into any agreement or compact with another state, quote, without the consent of Congress. For some observers, that's a pretty clear line. Even if states are allowed to do something like this, they need Congress to approve it for it to go into practice. On the other side of this question are those who point to Article 2, Section 1, which explicitly states that states have the right to appoint electors, quote, in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct, which would seemingly give states really broad latitude around how they award their electoral votes. All super simplified, but that's the crux of this conversation. And again, scholars are somewhat divided on how serious of an issue this would be, but I think you can probably bet that if the compact were to come into effect, the Supreme Court would definitely be asked to weigh in. One thing that is pretty certain, though, a presidential election decided by the popular vote would be wildly different from the system we have now. Here's one metric. In the 2024 presidential election, only 18 states even got an in-person visit from either party's ticket. And that was actually more than most recent presidential elections, partly because you had a whole bunch of states with one stop. If you look at which states got more than one visit, it narrows down to just 10. Meanwhile, a majority of all in-person campaign stops went to just 3 states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. A national popular vote system would flatten things way more. Because, as a reminder, every type of voter is in fact everywhere. Kamala Harris received more votes in Texas than in New York State. Donald Trump received more votes in New York City than in Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota combined. Harris received more votes in Appalachia, the heart of Trump country, than in Massachusetts. Trump got more votes in LA County, land of liberal elites than in Oklahoma. And you can go on and on and on with this. The point is, under a popular vote system, a lot more states become important, and their diversity starts to matter a lot more. Now look, obviously my cards are on the table here a little bit, but I really do mean this. If you support our current system, you are perfectly entitled to do so. That's fair. But the data shows us that the common arguments for the Electoral College, that it gives more power to small states, that it forces candidates to pay attention to overlooked parts of the country, are just objectively, plainly untrue. This system prioritizes a tiny number of states, most of which are bigger than most states. We have data on that. Of the states that got in-person visits in 2024, the median electoral vote count was 11, larger than the median electoral votes of states overall. And this is the big thing here, this is not even the system that the writers of the Constitution designed. This actually gets overlooked a lot because people so often argue something like the Constitution's writers wanted voters in small states to have a voice. In fact, the Constitution's writers did not want voters in any state to have a voice. The original purpose of the Electoral College, which we know from both the text of the Constitution and the writings of the Founding Fathers, was to ensure that the president was elected by elites, not by the general public. Alexander Hamilton repeatedly wrote about this, saying, quote, "The immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station, and the president should be chosen by, quote, a small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens." So did John Jay, who literally wrote that the Electoral College members should vote not based off what their state wanted, but off of, quote, the abilities and virtues of the candidates. So the original purpose of the Electoral College wasn't anything like what we have now, where we all go to the polls in November and each state's electoral votes are awarded based off of what their voters want. In fact, according to historians, it wasn't for decades into the country's history that most states had presidential elections like what we have now. And it wasn't until after the Civil War that every state did. And the reason this matters is because it shows that we have already changed the Electoral College system. States have already changed how they award their votes, and the actual functioning of the system is already way different from what was originally intended and designed. So there is already precedent for us changing the way the Electoral College works and allowing states to award their votes based on something other than the original purpose and design of the Electoral College. And again, if you support the current system, great, that's allowed. But just know you are already supporting breaking from the original design. And it just might change again. What do you think? Do you think this has a chance? Would you want your state to join? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to hit subscribe to the channel and my newsletter.